So picture this, two invasions of sovereign countries happening almost 50 years apart. One is met with this huge global outcry and massive support, while the other, well, it's met with almost a deafening silence from the West. So what gives? Why the completely different reactions? In this explainer, we're going to dive into Tony C. Antoniou's analysis of U.S. foreign policy and explore a really critical question. Is international law actually applied equally to everyone?
Okay, let's start with a moment we all remember, February 2022. The world just watched as Russia invaded Ukraine. And the response from the United States and its allies? It was immediate, it was powerful. We saw this incredible united front defending national sovereignty. And what we always hear about, the international rules-based order.
But here's the thing. Is that strong, principled stand the norm? Has it always been this way? Well, to answer that, we actually have to rewind the clock a bit to another invasion, one that's often forgotten but is absolutely crucial to understanding where we are today. So we're going back to 1974, to the island of Cyprus. In this case, it serves as a really critical, and frankly, a deeply problematic precedent for how the West responds to aggression.
The invasion wasn't just a single event. It was a two-phase attack. First, on July 20th, Turkish forces landed on the island. And then, and this is the shocking part, a second, even bigger invasion was launched in August, completely shattering an active ceasefire and grabbing a whole lot more territory.
And the result of that second wave was a deeply entrenched division. By the time the fighting finally stopped, Turkey was in control of a staggering 37% of the island. Now, this wasn't some temporary incursion. It was the start of an occupation that is, believe it or not, still going on to this day.
The human cost? Well, it was catastrophic. We're talking about 180,000 Greek Cypriots being violently forced out of the northern part of the island, driven from their homes and communities. It was a devastating wave of what many have called ethnic cleansing.
And what came next was just a litany of horrors. International groups, like the European Commission of Human Rights, documented terrible atrocities against civilians. We're talking executions, torture, rape, and just widespread looting. It really revealed the brutal nature of the invasion.
So, here's the million-dollar question. Where did the weapons for this invasion come from? Antoniou's analysis uncovers something pretty shocking. Between 85 and 90% of all the military gear Turkey used was supplied by the United States. And this was in direct violation of the U.S. Foreign Assistance Act, which explicitly forbids using American arms for aggressive invasions.
Okay, so with all of that from 1974 fresh in our minds, let's jump back to the present. How does the Western response to the 2022 invasion of Ukraine really stack up?
The difference is it's like night and day. For Ukraine, the West unleashed this absolute storm of economic sanctions against Russia, poured billions in military aid to help the Ukrainian resistance, and worked around the clock to isolate Russia on the world stage. The messaging was clear and unwavering. We must defend sovereignty and international law.
And when you place these two events right next to each other, you start to see this really uncomfortable pattern emerge. And this, right here, is the absolute core of the author's argument.
Let's just break it down. In 1974, the aggressor was Turkey, a key NATO ally, a friend. In 2022, it's Russia, an adversary. The U.S. response for Cyprus? A short arms embargo that was lifted pretty quickly. For Ukraine? Massive, sustained support. And the long-term result? The occupation of Cyprus was basically allowed to solidify, while Russia is facing this ongoing global isolation.
This brings us to a really crucial idea, the selective application of international law. The author argues that this is a deep-rooted problem in Western foreign policy. The rules, it seems, are enforced with an iron fist against enemies, but for friends, well, they're often bent or just flat-out ignored. And you have to ask, is that really a sustainable way to run a global order?
Right now, you might be thinking, okay, that was almost 50 years ago. Why are we still talking about it? Why does it matter now? Well, according to the analysis, this inconsistency has had real and very dangerous consequences that we're still dealing with today.
I mean, listen to this quote from the historian Philip Short. He draws a direct line from the fact that Turkey faced no real consequences to how Vladimir Putin was thinking decades later. He argues that when aggressors see other aggressors, especially ones aligned with the West, get away with it, it basically gives them a green light. It emboldens them to act because they think the world will just respond with some empty words.
And this is the heart of the problem today.
How can the West effectively lecture Russia or other nations about respecting the rules-based order when its own history shows it hasn't always played by those same rules? The author argues that this kind of inconsistency just shreds your moral authority and credibility on the world stage.
So, in the end, the judgment here is pretty harsh, but it's clear. The invasion of Cyprus wasn't just some regional tragedy, it was a huge test for the entire system of international law that was built after World War II. And in the author's view, it was a test that the system, and especially the United States, completely failed.
Now, to be absolutely clear, the author's point is not to argue against defending Ukraine. Not at all. The argument is that while the principle of defending Ukraine is 100% correct and necessary, the historical silence and inaction on a nearly identical case, the invasion of Cyprus by an ally, completely undermines the moral foundation of that very argument.
And that leaves us with a final, really provocative question. If the rules that are supposed to protect every nation from aggression are only applied some of the time and only to some of the players, what are they really worth? It's a question that challenges the very foundation of our entire international order.